seat.
The time for Monsieur Lalonde's ballot item has expired. We'll vote on this bill in about 100 minutes. Orders of the day.
Ballot item number 14, second reading of Bill 195, an act to amend the Election Finances Act to ban collusion in electoral advertising. Mr. Arnott.
Mr. Arnott.
Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 195, an act to amend the Election Finances Act to ban collusion in electoral advertising.
Mr. Arnott moves second reading of Bill 195, an act to amend the Election Finances Act to ban collusion in electoral advertising. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the honourable member has 12 minutes for his presentation. Mr. Arnott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to speak about my private member's bill, Bill 195, Banning Collusion in Electoral Advertising Act, and why it's needed to ensure fairness and transparency in our provincial election campaigns. As Canadians, we rightly value, indeed we treasure, our democratic rights. Willingly, we carry out our responsibilities as citizens in a democratic society. In one of his seminal fireside chats, the wartime President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, told Americans, quote, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." Yes, Franklin Roosevelt was an American, but I think it's interesting to point out that he spent countless summers at Campobello Island in New Brunswick, where his family had a summer home. He was the most Canadian of U.S. presidents. I'm sure there was no other American president in history who spent more of his life on Canadian soil than FDR. In our own time and in our own context, we might discuss the arsenals of democracy in a different way. Money, as we know, is needed to sustain our arsenal of democracy. In Ontario, each campaign needs some of the financial resources of its supporters to purchase the signs, to pay for the phones, to fund the Leaders Tour, to print and distribute pamphlets, and to buy advertising. Campaign advertising, of course, is one of the biggest expenses, and as we know, television advertising is very, very expensive. In order to maintain the fairness of our elections, we have established spending limits. We have them, among other reasons, so that well-funded special interests cannot determine the outcome of elections, so that big money cannot buy an election. We have campaign spending limits so that one party cannot gain an unfair advantage by flooding the airwaves with advertising to the point that the other parties and other perspectives are unable to compete. I believe these limits are necessary and in the public interest. We believe and we assert that the Ontario Liberal Party has attempted to gain such unfair advantage through an alliance with the so-called Working Families Coalition. In the last two provincial elections, the Working Families Coalition has funded multi-million-dollar ad campaigns attacking the Ontario PC Party, its leaders and its candidates. We believe to the direct benefit of the Ontario Liberal Party. We suspect they'll do it again this fall if given the chance. But who are these so-called working families? Do all of its members and contributors agree with their tactics? My wife, Lisa Arnott, has been a public school teacher for some 25 years. Accordingly, she is a member of the Ontario Elementary School Teachers Federation, which I understand is one of the contributors to the Working Families Coalition. My wife supports me, and she votes for me. As far as I know, secret ballots being another factor in our democratic system. But it appears that some of Lisa's union dues are dedicated, against her wishes, to the cause of my defeat and that of my colleagues. At our house, we don't think that's fair. It's wrong, and it's one of the reasons I became interested in this issue. If Lisa worked in the Catholic system instead of the public system, it appears she would be compelled to pay even more to support efforts to fund my defeat. This year, the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association decided to extract an extra $60 from each of its members to fund a $3 million war chest for its own campaign to support the Liberals. That's in addition to what that union is doing to support the Working Families Coalition. How many of their members and how many members of other unions have had their union dues taken away from them without their consent to fund political advertising to support a party that they as individuals do not support? This is one of the fundamental questions that the government has yet to address. Let's look at the organizations who comprise the Working Families Coalition. This was taken off the Working Families website this morning. The Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, Ontario Nurses Association, Canadian Auto Workers, International Brotherhood of Boilermakers Local 128, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Millwrights, International Union of Operating Engineers Local 793, Painters District Council 46, Ontario Pipe Trades Council, Service Employees International Union. Again, these organizations have every right to participate in the election, and their members individually have every right to support whoever they want. But do they have the right to collude with one political party, coordinating their advertising to support that political party, to get around the campaign spending limits that the other parties must obey by law? I submit that they do not. Now, I've been fortunate to have another private member's ballot item at this late date in the 39th Parliament. Given that we're in the lead-up to a provincial election, I wanted to take this opportunity to draw attention to this important issue that may have a significant impact on that election, giving one party a significant and unfair advantage over the others. If passed, my Bill 195 would ban collusion between a political party and a third party, in other words, an external organization, for the purposes of advertising in an election campaign. Canadian press reports that working families and other so-called third parties currently, quote, have no limits on the amount they can spend supporting or attacking a political candidate or party during an election, while the parties themselves are limited to total campaign spending of approximately $8 million this year. For the Liberal Party to be able to get around these spending limits would, of course, for them, be hugely advantageous. It is my understanding that officials from working families and the Ontario Liberal Party maintain that there are no connections between their respective organizations. If that is true, we would submit that the Liberals in this House would have no good reason to oppose this bill. If they do oppose our efforts, it would be a very clear indication that there are, in fact, links between working families and the Ontario Liberals, and we suggest possibly collusion. On May 7, 2009, the Select Committee on Elections met to consider issues pertaining to advertising during elections. The committee heard from Mr. Greg Essensa, who serves as the Chief Electoral Officer of Ontario. Mr. Essensa told the committee that he believes that a review and update of Ontario's election finance laws is warranted. He also explained that under current law, third parties are free to cooperate and coordinate their efforts with recognized parties. I quote Mr. Essensa's remarks from Hansard. There is no specific provision that prohibits a third party from cooperating or coordinating its advertising with either a political party or one of its candidates, provided that the party candidate is not actually controlling the third party's advertising." End quote. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, I don't dispute the right of external organizations, or individuals for that matter, to speak or advertise for or against any political party or candidate. That is their right, and it must be protected. But if they deliberately conspire with another political party, especially when they do so simply to get around our election spending laws, we maintain that's wrong. In cases of collusion, third-party organizations should be prepared to face scrutiny, and their spending limits should have to come within the party's existing spending limits. Mr. Essensa tells us that there are already more stringent requirements in place federally, in British Columbia, in New Brunswick, in Quebec, and that there are also regulations being proposed in Alberta at the time of his testimony. Again, I quote Mr. Essensa's testimony from Hansard. It is or will be an offence in these jurisdictions to collude for the purposes of circumventing spending limits for political parties, candidates, and third parties. Similarly, Bill 195 would seek to ensure that there can be no collusion between third parties and political parties. It also extends the limit that Section 38 of the Election Finances Act imposes on campaign expenses incurred by a registered party and persons or bodies acting on its behalf during an election campaign period to include advertising expenses incurred by a third party during a campaign period if the third party acted with the expressed or implied knowledge and consent of a registered political party. If the McGuinty Liberals are so sure that there is no collusion between working families and the Ontario Liberal Party, again, logically, they should support this bill. But if they don't support it, fair-minded people will wonder, what do they have to hide? People also need to realize that this issue goes well beyond working families and what we believe may well be their efforts to collude with the Liberal Party in the election this fall. This issue goes far beyond that. We must consider not only working families, but also other external organizations with undue capacity to influence the outcome of elections, the election of 2011, and many more elections perhaps to come. Now, Mr. Speaker, you and I have served in this legislature long enough to see things come full circle. I can recall that during the late 1980s, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation was furious with the Liberal government of David Peterson. At that time, teachers were very concerned with the management of their pension plan. The teachers' union wanted 50% control of the board of the teachers' pension plan, but the Liberals refused. When OSSTF went public with their concerns, Premier Peterson, I recall, dismissed them, calling them, quote, silly. That was the word that he used. I recall the Teachers' Federation leaders were inflamed by this and decided to mobilize their members against the Liberals. And so, in advance of the 1990 election, my very first election, the teachers' unions were working hard to defeat the Liberal government of the day. My recollection is that instructions from union headquarters came down, urging teachers to get involved in the election and get behind the candidate in each riding that seemed to have the best chance to defeat the Liberal candidate. My point, Mr. Speaker, is this. We don't know what the political landscape will be like in 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years. What we do know is that when it comes to our democracy, the people of Ontario rightly expect us to uphold the highest standards of fairness. They expect all parties to obey the law in spirit as well as letter. When there is a way to get around the election laws and rules, when one party gains an unfair advantage by colluding with an outside force, we have a situation that is fundamentally unfair. We have a situation today where the spirit of the election spending limits is being flagrantly flouted. Bill 195 represents a real and meaningful opportunity to change that. It's an opportunity to ensure that the law is upheld, loopholes are closed, elections are fair, just as the people of Ontario would expect from all of us. That's why I would strongly encourage all members of the legislature to support this bill this afternoon. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Further debate? The honourable member.